Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission, as always, is to take a really dense stack of sources, the articles, the history, the theories, and give you that ultimate shortcut to being well-informed. And today we are stepping back just about a century and navigating the shadows of one of Europe's most baffling and, frankly, disturbing true crime cold cases.
We are diving into Hinterkaifeck. It's a name that's just synonymous with this kind of brutal, almost organized chaos.
Right.
So picture this. It's a small, pretty prosperous, but very isolated farm about 70 kilometers north of Munich, Germany. The date is March 31st, 1922.
And what happened here, it really goes beyond a simple multiple murder.
Oh, absolutely. This was an execution of an entire household.
And what defines this deep dive for me, what makes this case just so unique in the annals of horror are two things.
Okay.
First, you have this barrage of terrifying warnings the victims got before the attack. And second, the killer's just unbelievable behavior after the massacre.
The post-crime behavior it's just on another level, a level of cold-blooded psychological control that you rarely ever see.
It's the ultimate study in how isolation can breed both, I guess, resentment and opportunity.
Exactly. So before we get into the events of that night, we really need to understand the 6 people who lived there.
And why they might have been targeted.
Right. So at the head of the family, you have the elderly couple, Andreas Gruber, who was 63, and his wife, Cecilia, 72.
And living with them was their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel. She was 35, and her 2 young children.
That's Cecilia, age 7, and the toddler, Joseph, who was only 2.
And then there's the 6th victim, which is just so tragic.
Yeah, we can't forget her. Maria Baumgartner, the new maid. She had literally just arrived hours before the attack.
Just hours. Unbelievable.
And the maid before her had fled in terror 6 months earlier, which, it tells you a lot about the atmosphere that was already on that farm. Marie was just in the wrong place at the absolute worst time imaginable.
Okay, so let's unpack the social context here, because our sources really highlight that the family dynamics are, well, they're probably central to the motive. They were well off for the area, but socially, they were completely cut off. Ostracized by the village.
Yeah, and that isolation was, well, it was earned. Andreas Gruber was notoriously violent, a miser, and just a tyrant to his family and his neighbors.
But the real poison at the heart of the family, the thing that destroyed their reputation, was this open secret.
Incest.
And this wasn't just a rumor, right?
No, not at all. There are surviving court records that explicitly confirm an incestuous relationship between Andreas and his daughter, Victoria.
Wow.
Exactly. So in 1922, Bavaria, rural communities were often very rigid, very judgmental. This generated intense scandal.
And the scandal gets even more personal when we look at the youngest victim, 2-year-old Joseph.
Yeah. The widespread local belief, and this is corroborated by multiple testimonies, was that Joseph was the biological son of Andreas, his own grandfather, not Victoria's dead husband.
So you've got a motive that's like economic, personal, and driven by this intense community resentment all at once.
A perfect storm. The killer could have been an outsider looking for some kind of moral vengeance, or someone internal driven by jealousy or a financial dispute. The family had just created this bubble of social alienation that left them so vulnerable.
So the tension was just palpable.
Absolutely. The Grubers weren't just disliked. In many cases, they were hated. And this context is so important because it makes those pre-attack warnings all the more terrifying.
So the family was isolated and hated? Did this resentment spill over into actual threats before that night?
It did. And the events leading up to March 31st, they read like the script of a horror film. They signaled that this invisible threat wasn't just watching them.
But might have already been inside the house.
Exactly. The first, and maybe the most famous sign, was the footprints. Andreas Gruber noticed these tracks in the fresh snow. They led directly from the dense forest to the locked farm door. And he was a sharp guy, a savvy farmer. He knew what he was looking at. But the really terrifying detail.
No footprints leading back out.
None. Which is a critical piece of evidence. It suggests the person either entered the farm and just stayed there, or they moved around in a way that hid their tracks.
And if we connect that to the killer's later behavior, it points to meticulous, long-term planning.
For sure. Not a spur-of-the-moment crime.
And the terror wasn't just visual, it was auditory, too.
Yeah, the family reported hearing footsteps coming from the attic at night. They searched multiple times, but they found absolutely nothing. No intruders, no signs of entry.
The psychological impact of that, I can't even imagine. Hearing steps above you, knowing someone is there,
Yeah.
but you can't find them.
It's devastating. It suggests the killer was hiding extremely well, or maybe the hiding place was specifically prepared, for days or even weeks.
And then there are other small details that just reinforce this idea of surveillance.
Like the newspaper.
A Munich newspaper was found on the property, a paper that no one in the family subscribed to or had bought.
Right. Someone was bringing the outside world right to their doorstep.
And the keys.
Critically, the house keys disappeared just days before the attack. So if the killer was already in the attic or the barn, this gave them total unfettered access and control over the whole house. No need for a forced entry.
What's so fascinating is that story about the previous maid. She quit 6 months earlier in a total panic, claiming the house was haunted.
Right.
Was she just sensing the early presence of this person? Or maybe seeing evidence of someone setting up shop?
It really suggests this campaign of terror was building over a long time. This wasn't just a murderer showing up one night. This was a stalker who basically integrated themselves into the landscape of the farm.
Creating enough dread that even these tough, stubborn people were genuinely afraid.
Exactly.
So now we move to the night itself, March 31st, 1922. The sequence of the attack. It just speaks volumes about the killer's incredible control. How did they manage to eliminate 5 people without any noise that would alert the 6th, the new maid, who was inside the house?
Well, the sources confirm the killer managed to lure the 4 adults and the 7-year-old into the barn one by one.
One by one, that's the key.
It is. Luring one person is hard enough. Luring 5 separate people requires immense silence, cunning, and probably familiarity.
They must have trusted the person, or at least not seen them as a threat.
Right, or maybe they were responding to a situation that seemed urgent but not dangerous, like a noise in the barn or something.
And the weapon of choice was a mattock, a heavy, pickaxe-like farming tool.
Close at hand, effective, and silent compared to a gun. The victims were struck with brutal force.
After dealing with the family in the barn, the killer moved into the farmhouse.
That's where 2-year-old Joseph was killed in his crib, and the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, was killed in her bedroom.
Killing the toddler in his crib shows just an absolute lack of mercy.
No hesitation. Targeting every single person on that property.
And some of the forensic details that emerge later, they just paint this harrowing picture of the brutality. The autopsy revealed something about the 7-year-old, Cecilia, that just sticks with you.
Yes. The pathologist determined that Cecilia did not die immediately.
Oh, cool.
For a period of hours, she lay injured next to the bodies of her mother and grandparents, conscious enough to be tearing out clumps of her own hair in shock and agony before she finally died.
That timeline, it just gives you this window into the prolonged suffering and the silence in that barn after the initial attacks.
Yeah.
The violence is shocking, but this is where the analysis gets truly, truly bizarre. Most killers flee immediately.
But this killer did the exact opposite.
Which is what criminologists have studied for decades, right?
It is. The killer remained on the farm for about 3 full days with 6 corpses. That is a rare, terrifying marker of complete control.
And they didn't just hide, they maintained this illusion of life.
Neighbors saw smoke from the chimney. The cattle were fed and fed on schedule. The dog was tied up but unharmed.
And food, bread and meat, was eaten from the pantry. The killer was literally running the Gruber farm.
Think about the psychological implications of that. To coexist with the victims you just murdered, sleeping in their beds, eating their food, doing their chores.
It speaks to a profound level of what? The psychopathy? Detachment.
It could be an attempt to buy time, to delay the discovery and throw off suspicion. Or it suggests this deep, twisted sense of entitlement. Like they owned the place now that the occupants were gone.
So how do you even categorize that? In early 20th century criminology, does that lean towards an organized killer who's extremely confident or something more deranged?
Well, it's often categorized as extremely organized behavior precisely because the killer maintained the crime scene, the entire farm, for 3 days. An organized killer is defined by control and planning.
Right.
And yet they made that initial mistake of leaving the footprints. The fact that they stayed and operated the farm suggests a really methodical, rational attempt to manipulate the timeline. Just total self-possession.
3 days later, April 4th, the neighbors finally get suspicious.
The family hadn't been seen, the mail piled up, and Cecilia, the 7-year-old, hadn't been to school.
They discover the gruesome scene, And unfortunately, the investigation that followed was almost as chaotic as the crime itself.
Oh, it was a mess. The investigation was immediately hampered. You had hundreds of curious onlookers, poorly trained police just trampling all over the farm.
So evidence was just lost from the start.
Contaminated, ignored, or lost. Over 100 suspects were questioned, but it was too little, too late.
And there's one part of the investigation that stands out as just truly bizarre.
Yes. The court physician, in an astonishing move, decided to decapitate the corpses of the 6 victims.
Wait, what? Decapitate them? Why would anyone do that?
It sounds absurd now, but you have to remember, forensic science was rudimentary, especially in rural Germany. The skulls were sent to Munich.
Not for forensic examination.
No. To be examined by so-called clairvoyants, psychics, in a bid to get some insight into who the killer was.
That's a complete abandonment of rational police work.
It is. It shows just how desperate they were, driven by the sheer brutality and mystery of the case.
And the ultimate tragedy is that these skulls, the only physical evidence of the primary injuries, offered no information.
And were later lost entirely during the World War II bombings of Munich. The Hinterkaifeck victims are buried today without their heads, a final macabre result of a totally botched investigation.
But despite the chaos, there was one person who was always under suspicion.
For decades, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He was the most scrutinized person in the whole investigation.
Schlittenbauer was a neighbor, and he had a clear, if, circumstantial motive.
And it tied right back to the family's dark secrets. He was a former suitor of Victoria, and the prevailing local rumor was that he was the biological father of little Joseph.
So he was angry about the incestuous dynamic, their refusal to acknowledge him, and maybe financial disputes over Joseph's upbringing.
Exactly.
And his actions right after the discovery were highly suspicious. He was one of the men who led the search party into the barn.
That's right. And witnesses later reported that when the bodies were discovered, Schlittenbauer was strangely calm. He showed no visible shock.
And he disturbed the bodies before the police could examine the scene.
Yeah, and there were also questions about how easily he navigated the dark barn to find them, suggesting he might have known the layout intimately or, maybe already knew where they were.
So if he was the prime suspect with a clear motive and all these suspicious actions, why wasn't he charged?
Well, despite the high probability that he was involved, or at least knew more than he let on, the lack of clean forensic evidence, thanks to that initial contamination and the lost skulls, meant there was never enough concrete proof.
So he just lived out his life under a cloud of suspicion.
Yep, denying it until his death.
The case went officially cold for decades, but that's where modern tech comes in. Fast forward to 2007.
Students from the German Police Academy in Fürstenfeldbruck decided to re-examine the entire case file.
A massive undertaking, I'm sure.
Huge. They used all the surviving original documents, witness statements, sketches, and they applied modern criminal profiling techniques and digital reconstruction.
And what did that modern analysis tell them about the killer's profile?
The conclusion pretty much reinforced what many had suspected all along. The crime was overwhelmingly likely committed by a single offender who was known personally to the family.
The lack of forced entry, the way they were lured one by one.
It all points away from a random transient and towards someone the Grubers would have trusted or at least not been immediately alarmed by.
And using this modern profiling, they went further than just a profile. They actually put a name to it.
They did. Their analysis concluded with the identification of a specific prime suspect with what the sources call a high probability. They were confident in who they believed committed the murders.
And that is the ultimate frustrating twist in this story. They solved it, but the public in history still doesn't know the name.
Right. The police academy made the conscious decision not to release the suspect's identity.
Why? What was the justification?
Respect for the suspect's living relatives. Because the case was so old and the evidence was so compromised, they felt they couldn't pursue a legal charge. So publishing the name would only damage the lives of people who had nothing to do with the crime.
For an audience that comes to a deep dive for that final piece of the puzzle, that decision is agonizing. It creates this profound tension, doesn't it?
It does.
For a case this historic, is the privacy of a relative a century later more important than historical closure?
It raises a powerful debate. Is the purpose of these cold case reviews purely legal, to get a conviction, or is it historical and educational?
And in this case, they chose privacy for the living.
Over the resolution of a monstrous crime, the identity of the person who stayed for 3 days, eating and sleeping next to the dead, remains locked away in an archive.
It's an incredible end to a nightmare story. When you look back at the whole sequence, the mysterious footprints with no return trail, the 6 victims, the killer's unbelievable 3-day stay, and the lost, decapitated skulls, it feels like a story that was just designed to never be fully resolved.
Even with modern tech identifying a suspect, the true cost of withholding that final piece of knowledge is the continuation of the mystery itself. It allows the horror of Hinterkaifeck to live on, fueled by speculation, precisely because the official record is incomplete.
And it makes you wonder, if the full truth had been released, would that just shift the focus of the horror from the killer's unknown identity to the living relatives now burdened by that crime? That's something for you to mull over as you contemplate the lingering shadows of Hinterkaifeck.